Rich and conceited, Tom Vance accepted a wager that would alter his life in unexpected ways. He thrived on competition because he was accustomed to succeeding in both business and life. At a lavish party in New York, however, Tom was intrigued by his close friend Jack's audacious challenge. Jack threw out the challenge with a sly smile. "Come on, Tom, let's see if you can win. You wouldn't have the courage to wed a woman who isn't your typical type, I bet." Tom, who is renowned for dating attractive women, was surprised, but he raised an eyebrow and inquired, "And what's the prize?" He was always eager to prove himself. Jack lifted his glass of champagne and said, $1 million to the winner, with a cheeky smile. However, you must wed her and remain wed for a minimum of 6 months. Tom instantly agreed because he could feel the excitement of competition and the allure of a financial challenge. Sarah Morgan, who defied traditional notions of beauty, was the woman Jack was referring to. Even though Tom didn't know her, he saw it as just another opportunity to win. Tom learned more about Sarah a few days later. She was very different from the women Tom was accustomed to. She was self-assured, self-sufficient, and independent. This piqued his interest even more. He was accustomed to being in charge and pondered how he would deal with someone who refused to comply. They met for the first time at a fancy restaurant. As soon as Sarah showed up, Tom realized she was unlike anyone he had ever met. Neither Tom nor the opulent setting seemed to intimidate her. Instead, she confidently met his gaze. Sarah said bluntly, "You must be Tom Vance," as she took a seat. "And you must be Sarah Morgan," Tom said, smiling subtly as he held out his hand. After a moment of hesitation, she demonstrated her resolve by shaking it firmly. Sarah started off by saying, "Let's not beat around the bush," in a direct manner. "I know why we're here. I know about the bet, the terms, and the conditions." Her directness surprised Tom, but he kept it to himself. He was curious about her reasons and asked, "And yet you still agreed to meet?" Sarah took a moment to think before responding. "I have my reasons, let's say. Tom, I'm not a fool. Although 6 months might not seem like much, a lot can happen in that time. You're wrong if you believe you can control or influence me." Tom grinned. The fact that Sarah was turning out to be more difficult than he had expected only added to the intrigue. As their initial encounter came to an end, Tom's interest in Sarah grew. She was unlike any person he had ever met. He was intrigued, even impressed, that she wasn't scared of him. Days went by and Tom kept thinking about how to proceed to the next phase. Although he was accustomed to controlling the game, it appeared that Sarah was now able to use her own strategies. In contrast to the upscale eateries Tom typically frequented, their second meeting was held at a modest cafe. Curiosity prompted Tom to accept Sarah's suggestion of the location. He was curious about her identity and the reasons behind her signing what appeared to be a short-term marriage contract. Sarah was drinking tea and smiling placidly when Tom got there. Without the coldness of their first meeting, she greeted him warmly and maintained her unwavering confidence. As Tom took a seat, Sarah teased, "I thought you preferred 5-star restaurants." Tom tried to sound casual, but he felt a little uncomfortable. "Sometimes it's good to break the routine," he said. They talked for a while, sharing superficial information, but Sarah cut right to the chase. Sarah put her teacup on the table and said, "If we're really going through with this, I want to make a few things clear. Your wealth and opulent lifestyle don't interest me. I intend to leave this exactly as I found it because 6 months is 6 months." Tom kept a close eye on her. He was aware of her honesty. Sarah was the kind of woman who knew what she wanted, and unlike many others, she obviously didn't view marriage as a means of moving up the social scale. Inquiringly, Tom said, "So what do you want, Sarah?" She said, "Freedom," without hesitation. "Despite the fact that we are making this agreement, I want you to know that I will not be ruled by you. A short-term marriage won't change the fact that I have my own life." Tom grinned. He didn't mind giving Sarah this freedom, even though it wasn't the response he had anticipated. Marriage was merely a formality to win the wager, in his opinion. He wouldn't mind if she wished to remain independent. "Fine," Tom said. 6 months, and after that we go our separate ways." Sarah observed him briefly, as though she wanted to confirm that he truly accepted the conditions. She was determined to make sure everything went as planned, and she had a plan in place when she took on this challenge. She trusted her own strength to withstand Tom's influence, even though she knew deep down that he might try to control the situation. After a cordial meeting, both parties left with their roles clearly defined. Tom would make sure the marriage was only a formality, and Sarah would maintain her independence. However, Tom couldn't help but think that perhaps this game wasn't as easy as he had thought as the days went by, and the wedding date drew near. The wedding was conducted in a chilly, informal way, akin to a meticulously planned business agreement. Because of his strategic thinking, Tom Vance already considered himself the winner of the wager. Despite Sarah's stubbornness, he was confident that she would eventually accept the opulent lifestyle he was about to offer her, and that the 6 months would pass quickly. Following the ceremony, Tom showed Sarah his enormous penthouse in the center of New York, which is a testament to his wealth. The interior was adorned with the priciest and most exclusive decor, and the enormous glass windows reflected the city lights. He saw this as the actual battlefield, where he would use the strength of his material world to win Sarah over. However, Sarah made it apparent right away that she would not back down. From the moment she entered the penthouse, she remained aloof. She gave Tom a look of defiance rather than admiration. She walked over to one of the large windows and gazed at the city without being impressed by the luxury surrounding her. 6 months, Tom. Not a day more, she said firmly. Tom grinned with assurance. At first, he was accustomed to this kind of opposition. All the women in his life eventually yielded to his wealth and charm. He assumed Sarah wouldn't be any different. Tom made every effort to win her approval in the initial days following the wedding. He lavished her with designer clothing, pricey jewelry, and lavish vacations in the hopes that Sarah would begin to conform to his controlled way of life. To his annoyance, though, she turned it all down. Sarah refused to give in to the luxuries of wealth and insisted on maintaining her straightforward, modest routine. She would calmly say, "I don't need these things, Tom," which only made him more agitated. He was deeply troubled by it. For the first time, Tom, who always got what he wanted, was having his power questioned. The bet was no longer the only thing at stake. It was now personal. He had to convince Sarah that he was ultimately in charge. He had to win her over somehow. At that point, he began to play with greater aggression. "You don't need a paycheck anymore," he said, deterring her from going to work, "and your role is as my wife." When Sarah persisted, he made her wait for hours for meetings she believed were crucial. To keep things under control, Tom manipulated events and schedules. Sarah, though, refused to back down. The fact that she resisted Tom's attempts to break her only made him want to do so more. Their relationship started to spiral out of control as little provocations arose in innocuous conversations, and Sarah skillfully deflected every attempt by Tom to make her feel inferior or in control. Tom attempted a more sentimental strategy on one especially tense evening. He said, "I don't understand you, Sarah," as he looked at her with a mixture of interest and frustration. "Any other woman would be happy to live this kind of luxury, but you act like it's not enough. What do you really want?" Sarah's eyes, which had been expressionless until that point, glowed with a brightness that surprised Tom. "What am I looking for?" "Tom, I want respect. Your chessboard does not have me as a piece. You're mistaken to believe that money can control me. Integrity and dignity cannot be purchased with money. You may be surrounded by all of these things, but what you can't stand is the emptiness inside of you." Her words were like a kick to the stomach. Tom thought he might be losing more than control for the first time. He was afraid because Sarah was not only opposing his authority, but also tearing down the front he had cultivated over the years. He had never faced such a challenge, and Tom felt vulnerable because Sarah saw past his wealth. However, Tom made the decision to tighten his hold rather than retreat. He began preparing to isolate Sarah in order to show her how much more difficult life would be without him. He sabotaged significant events she was planning, severed connections, and blocked opportunities for her career advancement. But Sarah was not the kind to be intimidated easily. More determined than ever, she got back up after each blow. Refusing to let Tom mold her, she maintained her dignity. Then Sarah dealt herself a hand one evening. She said calculatingly, "Tom, you think you're in control, don't you? However, you are unaware that I also have a plan. And trust me when I say that this entire game is based on something far more significant than you could have ever guessed." Startled, Tom gazed at her. He became aware for the first time that he might have underestimated Sarah, and he began to fear that he might not win this game after all. The weeks passed like a tautly coiled rope, getting more tense every day until it finally broke. Sarah continued to resist without flinching, despite Tom's constant attempts to use his obsession with control to his advantage. She resembled a stronghold that he was unable to destroy. Her inner strength seemed to be strengthened by every effort he made. However, Tom was unable to ignore the fact that his perception of Sarah began to change over time. There was more to it than merely appreciating her tenacity. She was disarming him emotionally in a way that no other woman had ever done before, which left him feeling uncomfortable and perplexed. For the first time, he found himself considering her as a person he truly wanted to understand, rather than as a rival or a component of a wager. After a furious dispute one evening, Tom was by himself in the spacious living room, gazing out the glass windows at the city. He used to feel powerful from the glow of the city lights, but now everything seemed hollow. He questioned why he was experiencing these emotions. He had only been married to Sarah for 6 months. She ought to have been nothing more than a piece in his game. In actuality, though, she was arousing something within him. He had always kept his feelings in check, but now he was feeling them. Because Sarah could see right through his facade, he felt exposed. Sarah continued her routine while Tom struggled with his thoughts. She appeared more aloof every day, as though she were anticipating something. Tom was plagued by the feeling that there was an imperceptible barrier separating them that he was unable to penetrate. There was something about Sarah that drew him in that he never thought was possible, and he wasn't sure if it was pride or the fear of losing control. "You're different," Tom told his friend Jack, who had put the wager forward over a laid-back dinner. "Normally you'd have everything under control by now, but it seems like this woman is challenging you in a way no one else has." Unable to answer immediately, Tom smiled artificially. It was obvious that something was changing, even though he hated to acknowledge that Jack was correct. Tom returned home that evening resolved to make amends. He needed to stop thinking about Sarah and remind himself that this was only a contract. Upon entering the penthouse, he discovered Sarah reading a book on the couch, oblivious to his presence. Tom broke the silence that had grown ingrained between them by asking, "Can we talk?" Sarah glanced up, closed her book calmly, and looked at him with a calm yet focused expression. She said, "Of course," as though she had been anticipating this. Sitting opposite her, Tom searched for the right words. You could feel the tension between them. He was aware that he could no longer treat this marriage as a mere formality. He had to confront the fact that something was changing. He asked with a sincerity that even shocked him, "What are we doing here, Sarah? This started as a game, a bet, but I don't know what to think anymore." Before answering, Sarah looked at him for a few moments. "I'm not playing, Tom. I never was," she said in a composed yet profound voice. "I accepted this marriage from the start for reasons that are not related to you. The money and your power over things don't matter to me. Maybe it's time to wake up if you haven't already realized that I'm here for something greater." Tom felt his chest constricted. She seemed to be disclosing a secret that he was still unable to decipher. He was filled with frustration. He stood up abruptly, unable to remain motionless as though the realization was too much to handle. "I know you have your secrets, Sarah, but what irritates me is the more I try to understand you, the more I realize I'm not in control, and I hate that." Sarah stayed composed, observing his every action. She rose slowly and approached him, pausing a few inches from him. Tom's heart pounded. "Tom," she said softly and quietly, "this isn't about control. You've spent your entire life attempting to control everyone and everything. You'll have to discover, though, that control isn't always the solution when working with me. There are times when things simply must be as they are." For an instant, Tom felt a connection he had never experienced before as he gazed into her eyes. He seemed to be genuinely seeing Sarah for who she was, rather than as a piece in his game, for the first time. With his voice now barely audible, he said, "So, what do you want?" Sarah grinned, a cryptic grin that chilled him. I want you to figure that out for yourself." She then turned to leave, leaving him there by himself to think. The gap between them appeared to widen over the next few days. But oddly, Tom started to feel more connected to Sarah than ever. He was fixated on discovering what she was concealing and what her real motivations were. He also thought he was losing control of himself at the same time. Despite his reluctance to acknowledge it, Sarah was altering his perspective on the world, and the thought that she might have such a profound impact on him frightened him. Even though Tom Vance's 6 months of marriage were almost over, every day seemed to drag on forever. He had trouble falling asleep. His stomach turned at the impending revelation he felt he was about to learn. In his life, Sarah had evolved into a mysterious figure. He considered her to be someone who knew something he couldn't understand, not just the woman he had married on a whim. He was consumed by his desire to comprehend Sarah. He had done everything he could to find out what secret she held, but every response he gave only raised more questions. Tom employed detectives, investigated her past, and pursued every lead he could, but it all appeared to have been meticulously planned by Sarah. She seemed to be in control of the game from the start, always one step ahead. Tom was late to the penthouse one evening after a business meeting. Sarah was sitting there with the balcony light on, gazing out over New York like a queen watching over her realm. He was aware that everything would be made public tonight. Tom thought she was about to tell him what he had been so anxious to hear, but his throat constricted in anticipation of what he might hear. His footsteps reverberated in the silent room as he approached her. Sarah did not immediately turn around. The atmosphere was thick, as though both of them were aware that something terrible was going to happen. Tom said, "I need answers, Sarah," in a firm voice despite his racing heart. "I can't take this game anymore. You have to tell me the truth." With a slow sigh, Sarah got up from her chair and looked at him. Normally composed and calculating, her eyes now glowed with a feeling Tom couldn't understand. Something dark and ferocious had changed in her. She crossed her arms and smiled bitterly. "The truth, Tom? Do you really want the truth?" He nodded without hesitation, but every second that went by increased the tension in the air. Nothing could have prepared Tom for what he was about to hear, but he braced himself for any response. Sarah said, "You have no idea who I am," with a cold tone in her voice. "You've always seen people as pawns on your chessboard, but this time, Tom, you were the pawn. I've been playing this game from the start." A chill went through Tom's body. In front of her, the assurance he had always had about being in charge was starting to waver. Sarah stopped him before he could say anything. Her voice sharpened as she went on, "Do you remember the name Morgan? You don't, of course. Individuals like you never recall. Before you came along and destroyed it, my father's little business was struggling to stay afloat." Tom took a step back, trying to make sense of the situation as his mind raced. "What?" stumbled a bewildered Tom. "What are you talking about?" Sarah stepped closer to him, pain and rage blazing in her eyes. "Tom, my dad. Before you came along and took everything away, he was a good man trying to provide for our family. Tom, you destroyed him. My father killed himself because of your empire, your success at any cost," Sarah said, pausing for a moment before continuing with tears in her eyes. "He lost everything, and it led to his death." Her words were like a kick to the gut, and Tom stood frozen as memories slowly came flooding back to him. He couldn't recall all the companies he crushed to get to the top, the deals he made, the contracts he signed, and the lives he touched. But now, all of that was suddenly coming back to haunt him. Desperate, he tried to interrupt. "Sarah." But she stopped him with a raised hand. "No, it's not just about money, Tom. It's about lives destroyed. You took my father away from me, the only person I had in the world, and while you prospered, my mother and I fell into debt and despair. You lived your life in luxury and we hardly had anything to eat," she yelled, her rage erupting. Tom was in utter shock, unable to speak, unable to defend himself, unable to do anything but stand there and stare at her while the guilt weighed heavily on his chest. Sarah went on to say, "But I planned everything," in a tone that was more composed but still tinged with bitterness. "When I heard about your bet, I saw my opportunity. I deliberately came up to you. I accepted the bet because I wanted you to feel even a small portion of what I felt. I wanted you to understand what it's like to be taken advantage of, controlled, and left helpless." Tom's entire body shook. He had always felt in control, always thought he would win, but now the roles were reversed, with Sarah, the player, controlling the entire board and Tom as the target. Tom started to say, "Sarah," but his voice was tremulous. I had no idea. I had no idea you were—" "No, Tom," Sarah cut in, moving closer until she was looking him in the eye. "You never cared, so you never knew. You thoughtlessly destroyed lives, and now I'm here to make sure you never forget what you did, not to destroy you. Tom, I want you to know that the suffering you inflicted will follow you for the rest of your life." Sarah's words dripped over him like a sentence, and Tom was confronted with something he had never encountered before. The actual repercussions of his actions. The guilt was unbearable, and he realized that he had lost more than just a bet. He had lost something that he would never be able to regain. Sarah moved away, and the penthouse was filled with silence. Tom's legs gave out, and he fell onto the couch, unable to speak, with no answers, just emptiness. Sarah's revelation echoed in Tom's mind like unrelenting thunder, shattering him with each word she said. The world he believed he knew, the woman he believed he could control, the pawn in his game of power and wagers, had just turned the whole thing upside down, and for the first time Tom was genuinely out of control and unsure of how to respond. He didn't have time to think, though, because Sarah left him alone in the room after telling him the truth about her father's suicide and the destruction of her family. Tom stood there, frozen in place, the penthouse's air suffocating as if everything were falling apart, and he wanted to talk to her, apologize, explain the inexplicable, but he couldn't. How could he justify something so cruel, something that had caused so much pain? As a continual reminder of his failure, Sarah walked past him as if he were invisible, as if his existence were nothing more than a shadow. In the days after her revelation, Sarah did exactly what Tom feared most. She ignored him completely. She sat in silence at breakfast, hardly raising her eyes, and when he attempted to speak, his words failed to penetrate the wall she had created between them. The man he believed he was slowly being destroyed by the weight of this forced silence. Tom, who was accustomed to commanding the room and being the center of attention, was now being ignored in his own home. The lack of attention was intolerable. Sarah spoke to the staff and took care of her personal affairs, but with Tom, it was as if he didn't exist. One morning, as she was getting ready to leave, he tried to call Sarah, saying, "We need to talk." Sarah paused, still turning her back on him, adjusting her coat. The air became more silent, and Tom waited, hoping for a response, any word, even rage, since that would have been preferable to apathy. However, Sarah remained silent and just walked out, softly shutting the door, leaving Tom with the sound echoing in his head. Tom was accustomed to dominating and winning, but now he was the one being manipulated, punished by silence and contempt. Each time she left him standing by himself, the sense of helplessness increased, and that was only the beginning. The pain of being ignored by someone he was starting to see as much more than an enemy was something new to Tom. At work, Tom noticed that crucial meetings were being abruptly rescheduled. His business decisions were suddenly being questioned, and projects he had started inexplicably started to fail. Sarah didn't stop at silence. She started actively undermining Tom's confidence in tiny, painful ways. Even though she never acknowledged it, Tom knew that Sarah was responsible for these things, and he felt her influence in everything she did, as if she were tugging at the invisible threads that held his life together. At home, things were becoming worse, so Sarah adopted a posture of complete contempt, purposefully avoiding any of Tom's attempts at reconciliation, ceasing to sit with him at meals, avoiding any conversation that went beyond the surface, and giving him icy looks when he followed her, attempting to make amends, as though he were an annoyance. Tom discovered her reading a book in the living room one evening. The scene appeared serene, but he knew it was a silent trap, so he sat on the couch and tried to speak again. He said, "Sarah," in a low, almost beseeching voice, "I know I've done terrible things. I am aware of how much pain I have caused you. But could we try to resolve this, please? Can we at least have a conversation? Without a glance in his direction, Sarah closed the book slowly, and when she opened her eyes, he shivered at the coldness of her face. "Speak. You think there's anything left to say?" she repeated, laughing bitterly. "Tom, do you want words? Words don't matter after everything you've done." "Sarah, I was mistaken. I would do anything to right what I've done," Tom insisted, rising from the couch and advancing closer, desperate for any connection. "I promise that I can change." At last, she gave him a sharp look, as though to challenge him to keep his own promises. "Modification? Do you think that changing now will make everything go away? Will it bring my father back? Will it make up for the years we suffered because of you?" "No, Tom, it won't," she said, slowly getting to her feet. Tom felt himself sink as she took a step closer, her intense gaze crushing him. "I don't care about what you do now. It's for you. For the rest of your life, you will bear this burden and this guilt." Tom remained silent, realizing for the first time that there would be no quick fix, no easy redemption, and that he wanted to fight for something that could be fixed. But Sarah was beyond repair. Sarah's punishments became more severe in the days that followed, and Tom's frustration became desperate as he tried to show her that he was improving and that he was changing. But every time he did so, he was met with sarcasm or disdainful looks whenever he passed her. He heard bits of the conversation and realized it was Sarah talking about his decisions at work, and he knew it was her. One night, after a disastrous meeting at work where a crucial project had been sabotaged, Tom came home to find Sarah laughing on the phone. She was ruining everything he had worked for, but in a way that was so subtle and calculated that only he would notice, and she made him suffer in silence. Tom was waiting in the living room, staring at Sarah with a weary expression that was a mixture of pain and suppressed anger when she hung up. "Don't you feel like you're destroying everything?" "At work, here," he said in a low voice that was clearly frustrated. "My life is being destroyed by you." Sarah crossed her arms and met his gaze with a detached expression. "Ruining your life? Don't worry, Tom, I won't ruin your finances. That would be too easy. I want you to live with the pain. I want you to feel every little loss, just like I did. I want you to watch everything you built fall apart every day and know that it's your fault," she said, raising an eyebrow. It was a nightmare, and Tom felt the ground vanishing beneath his feet once more. He had always been the victor, the man who dictated the fates of others. But now he was the object of a ruthless and methodical retaliation. The worst was yet to come, but Sarah didn't want to ruin him all at once. She wanted him to suffer day by day, with every little setback, every look of contempt, until he had nothing left but regret. Weeks went by, and Sarah kept ignoring and punishing him. Tom, who had once been self-assured and cocky, now wandered the house like a shadow of his former self, trying in every way to earn a forgiveness he knew would never come. He tried to redeem himself, but his efforts were never enough, and he was caught in a vicious cycle of pain and guilt, which Sarah mastered. Then one night, with a coldness Tom had never experienced before, Sarah came up to him as he sat on the couch, broken and tired, and said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Her voice was calm but sharp as she started. "Tom, you took something from me that I can never get back," adding, "Now I'm returning the favor, and you will live with that for the rest of your life." With those words, Sarah left him speechless. She didn't have to. The punishment was already underway, and Tom Vance knew he would never be the same. Sarah had managed to make him understand what it was like to be out of control, and the weeks that followed her revelation had been intolerable. Tom was a shadow, a pale reflection of the man he had once been, no longer the self-assured, cocky man who thought he controlled everything around him. And every time he tried to talk to Sarah, he was met with icy stares, ignored, and rejected. Her lack of interest was eating him alive, and he could not sleep, thinking only of trying to mend what he had broken. But the weight of the truth and the deeds of his past made that path seem nearly impossible. But then something changed in Tom. He understood that his words were worthless, that apologies were useless, that Sarah needed to see real change, that he was prepared to do whatever it took to show her that he was genuinely transformed, that he needed actions, not just words. When Tom woke up one morning, He was determined to do something different. And he knew that the first step would be to give Sarah space. He knew that she needed to see that he respected her time and that he would no longer put pressure on her. But he also knew that he needed to show that he was still there in small but meaningful ways. While he didn't follow her or intrude on her personal space, Tom started to focus on the little things that made up Sarah's life, observing her daily routines, her preferences, and her likes. He mentally noted everything she loved, such as flowers, particularly peonies, and the scent of her coffee in the morning, which was always strong and sugar-free. These seemingly unimportant details were now crucial to his attempt to reconnect with her. Tom went to one of the best flower shops in town that same afternoon and bought a bouquet of peonies. He didn't give them to Sarah directly because he knew she would reject them right away, so he left them on the kitchen table without a note, simple but meaningful, and waited anxiously while she went for a walk. When Sarah came back, she found the bouquet. She didn't say anything, but Tom saw out of the corner of his eye the precise moment she stopped in front of the flowers, and he saw her pick up one of them and smell them. It was a small gesture, but for Tom, it was a sign that Sarah hadn't rejected them outright. Throughout the days that followed, Tom continued to make small gestures to show that he had changed, that he was paying attention, and that he truly wanted to care for Sarah. He set the breakfast table with care, made her coffee strong the way she liked it, and then left without bothering to be seen. He always left small items she enjoyed within her reach and never forced a meeting or conversation. Sarah refused to compromise, though, and Tom knew it would take time to get past her wall. He was determined to prove to her that he was different and that he could win her back, but only if he did so on her terms and with consideration for her need for privacy. On a particularly cold evening, things started to change. Sarah was watching the city lights from the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, when Tom finally approached her and brought her a cup of hot tea because he knew she preferred to have something warm before bed. Without imposing himself, he said, "Here, I thought you might like something hot," in a calm voice. The silence between them was tense, but for the first time in weeks it didn't feel intolerable, as if something was changing, even if it was only slightly. Sarah took the cup without saying anything at first, her eyes still fixed on the city ahead, and Tom stood next to her, silent, just trying to be present without interfering. "Tom, what are you doing?" At last, Sarah spoke up, her tone firm but gentle. Tom took a deep breath before answering, aware that this was his moment to speak, but he had to be careful. "I'm trying to show you that I'm changing. I want to be a better person, not just for you, but because I realized I need to be. Because I realized that talking doesn't mean anything anymore," he started, gazing out at the horizon with her. "My words don't matter. I can't make amends for what I did." The cold wind blew past them, but the tension seemed to lessen a bit, and Sarah held the cup of tea silently for a few more seconds. She finally said, "You can't change the past, Tom," in a softer tone than he had anticipated. "Sincerely, I know," he said, "but I can change the future." Tom noticed a change in Sarah's eyes when she looked at him for the first time that night. The hardness was still there, but there was a glimmer of interest. He knew that she wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but this was a pivotal moment, and he had touched on something she might want to believe. The barriers were beginning to come down, even if only slowly, and in the days that followed, Tom continued his little gestures, but there was a different energy between them. Sarah was still keeping her distance, but she wasn't rejecting him as openly as before, accepting the flowers, the cups of tea, and even letting him speak to her briefly and superficially during breakfast. However, Tom was about to leave for a meeting one evening when the true test occurred. With an expression he couldn't quite read, Sarah entered the room as he was getting ready for another business meeting. "Is it possible to postpone your meeting?" she asked abruptly. After a moment of hesitation, Tom nodded, grabbed his phone, and abruptly ended the meeting because it was the first time in weeks that Sarah seemed interested in spending time with him, and he didn't want to miss it. She had never been interested in his whereabouts since their relationship had ended. Sarah looked thoughtful, as though she was taking in everything that had transpired over the past few months, and they sat on the couch, a little distance apart. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel awkward. Sarah broke the silence by saying, "You're showing me something different, but I'm not ready to forgive you completely. You seem to be making an effort, and perhaps that marks the start of something." The night went on calmly, with the two of them talking about insignificant things, but for Tom, it was a victory. He was gradually rebuilding something with patience. Sarah was no longer an untouchable figure. She was beginning to let her guard down, and Tom wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating her again. Tom's heart raced. He knew that he couldn't rush things, but Sarah's words were enough to keep his hope alive. He knew the road ahead would still be long, but he was willing to take every step if it meant earning her forgiveness, and perhaps her love. But for the moment, it was enough that Sarah was willing to talk, even though Tom knew she hadn't told him everything yet, that there was something she was still keeping hidden, and he needed to be ready to face it. There was a hesitancy in the air, a sort of waiting that kept him on edge, and he knew he was being tested, and he was ready for it. But he didn't realize that something much bigger was about to be revealed. The weeks that followed that quiet evening were a mixture of tension and hope. For the first time in a long time, Tom felt as though he was making progress with Sarah. She no longer treated him with complete coldness, but she also didn't open up completely. He canceled work commitments to spend more time at home, making sure to be available for her without pressuring her or demanding answers right away. And small gestures, like making breakfast together or talking about trivial things in the evening, became part of their routine. Slowly, the ice between them melted, and Tom realized that Sarah no longer treated him with the same contempt. Tom devoted his entire life to proving to Sarah that he had changed. Somehow, though, he was still troubled by the fact that, in spite of the progress, he sensed that Sarah was concealing something. She was reserved at times, avoiding more in-depth discussions about the past or the future, as though she was waiting for the right opportunity to speak. But Tom was unsure of what that opportunity was. Then one night, when the rain pattered softly against the penthouse windows, Tom saw a change in Sarah's demeanor. She appeared more reflective, more aloof than normal, as though she was deep in thought. He tried not to press her, but his curiosity was growing. What was she concealing? What had not yet been spoken? Tom finally broke the barrier when the silence got too much. "Sarah," he said in a low, almost frightful voice, "I know that you haven't told me about something that still exists between us. Please, if there's something you're still holding back, I need to know," he said, looking into her eyes to gauge her response. At first avoiding Tom's eyes, Sarah, sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, took a deep breath. But Tom knew he had to be patient, because he knew that forcing anything now could reverse all the progress he had made. The silence that followed was painful. At last she turned to face him, a mixture of pain and determination visible in her eyes. She said, "You're right, Tom," in a quiet but passionate voice. "I've been keeping something from you, something I didn't think I could tell you until now. However, it might be time." Tom leaned forward a little, anticipating the revelation that was about to happen, but he was also afraid of what he might hear. Whatever it was, he knew it would change everything. "Remember the business that you destroyed, the one my dad oversaw?" Sarah said, "I told you that you destroyed our family, and that's true," in a firm voice that betrayed her intense pain. "However, you didn't just destroy that." Tom gave her a perplexed look and asked, "What do you mean?" With a worried tone, he inquired. When Sarah finally spoke again, her voice was softer, almost a whisper, and she lowered her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill out. "I was pregnant, Tom." Tom blinked as he tried to take in what he had just heard, but he was unable to believe it. Those words struck him like a crushing weight. "What?" Stunned, he whispered. "I was pregnant at the time when everything happened," Sarah added, her gaze still on the ground. "And the pressure and stress of it all when we lost everything, when my father was gone, I lost the baby." The realization hit Tom like a punch to the stomach, something he never could have predicted, and the guilt he had been feeling for weeks seemed to intensify even more. Tom felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet and he was having trouble breathing. He had ruined a life in addition to a business and a family. He choked his voice as he tried to say, "Sarah, I didn't. I never would have thought that." When she finally turned to face him, The tears she had been suppressing now poured down her cheeks, and despite the pain on her face, she exuded an indisputable strength. Sarah said, "No, you didn't know," in a voice full of bitterness and hurt, "because you never cared to know. Tom, you ruined lives without even glancing at those who stood in your way. You continued living your life as if nothing had happened while I lost my baby." Tom was slashed by her words, and he wanted to say or do something to make up for what he had done. But he knew that nothing he did or said would make up for what Sarah had endured. In a weak, dejected voice, Tom finally said, "I don't have the words. I know what I did is unforgivable, and I'll never forgive myself for it. But I would do everything in my power to try to put this right, Sarah. Anything." Tom knew that nothing he said could change the past or bring the baby back, but he was desperate to find a way to at least lessen the pain Sarah was feeling. Sarah watched him for a long moment, and the silence that followed was heavy. At last, as though deciding something inwardly, Sarah inhaled deeply and closed her eyes. And when she opened them again, her face had changed. The pain was still there, but there was also something else, something Tom couldn't quite place. "I honestly don't know if I can forgive you, Tom," she said, adding that what you did and what transpired was heartbreaking. But she hesitated, as though considering what to say next. "I see that you're making an effort, and perhaps there is a possibility that I will eventually figure out how to proceed. It won't be simple, though. It won't happen quickly." Tom nodded, uncertain, but hopeful that at least Sarah was open to the idea of a different future, even though he knew the path ahead would be difficult. Tom replied, "I'll do whatever it takes," his voice full of resolve. "No matter how long it takes, I'll prove to you that I've changed, that I can be someone you trust, and maybe one day forgive." For the first time when Sarah looked at him, a tiny gap appeared. It wasn't complete forgiveness. It wasn't the end of all the pain, but it was something. It was the start. "We'll see," Sarah sighed softly, "if you can." There was a heavy silence between them, but one that was also full of possibilities. And then Sarah got up and went toward the door, leaving Tom alone on the couch. But this time he felt less hopeless than before, knowing that a long journey lay ahead. After Sarah's revelation, Tom's life changed. He felt the guilt of all the hurt he had caused, and every word she said weighed heavily on his mind. Instead of wallowing in regret, Tom chose to use the pain and guilt as motivation to change. He didn't just want to win back Sarah's love. He wanted to become a man who was worthy of her respect and the respect of the many people he had wronged during his brutal business career. Tom decided that morning that he would not simply watch the past condemn him forever. Instead, he would begin anew, with the first step being to fix as much of the damage as possible so that he could show Sarah that he had changed for the better. His first visit was to the family of an old rival, whose business he had destroyed years before. He knocked on the door of a modest house in a neighborhood far removed from the luxury of his own life, and although the man answering the door was unfamiliar to Tom, the pain in his eyes was not. He started pursuing the families whose lives had been destroyed by his business dealings. Tom said, "I'm Tom Vance," with a sincerity in his voice that he hardly recognized in himself. "I'm here to apologize." The man looked at him for a long time, his eyes full of incredulity. "Sorry?" With a bitter laugh, he said, "What will change now?" "I can't change the past," Tom said firmly, "but I can try to help rebuild the future. I'm here to make amends and help repair what I damaged." In the weeks that followed, Tom persisted in his quest for atonement, knocking on doors, meeting with families, and offering not only cash but also his time, his attempt to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. He started giving large sums of money to small businesses that had been harmed by his corporate machinations, and he established recovery programs to assist other business owners in getting back on their feet. As the days went by and Tom demonstrated a genuine change, Sarah started to feel something new toward him, a renewed respect and admiration she hadn't anticipated. He was changing, and he was demonstrating that his words were no longer empty. At first, she was cautious, watching how Tom behaved, knowing that forgiveness wouldn't come easily. Tom, who had just returned from another of his reconciliation visits, approached Sarah quietly one evening as she stood on the balcony, taking in the city lights. His expression had changed to one of calmness and resolve. "How did today go?" Sarah inquired, continuing to gaze at the horizon. "Tough," Tom acknowledged, "but necessary." He sighed, a heavy sigh that held months of regret and effort. "For me as well as for you, Sarah, every discussion and every apology is a step toward improving myself." The hardness that had always been there, the anger she'd held onto, seemed to have softened as she finally turned to face him. She could see that Tom was genuinely changing at that moment. He was no longer the haughty man who had come into her life with a bet. Instead, he was someone who was willing to fight for them and fight to be different. "I can see that, Tom," Sarah said in a gentle yet firm voice, "and I want you to know that I'm willing to give it a shot. Perhaps it's time to move on from the past and create something fresh." Those words meant more to me than I could have ever imagined. Sarah was willing to give them a chance, not as the couple forced together by a bet, but as two people ready to start over. Tom felt a wave of relief he didn't even realize he was waiting for. They were no longer the distant couple stuck in an arranged marriage. Instead, they were two people rediscovering each other in a real, heartfelt way. As the 6-month marriage agreement came to an end, something unexpected started to happen. Sarah and Tom grew closer. Their conversations became less formal and tense. They shared moments of laughter and connection, and gradually, love began to blossom in a way neither of them had anticipated. As the 6-month period came to an end, Tom made a special dinner one night because he knew it would be a turning point, and he didn't want the marriage to end there because they had come so far. "I know our agreement is almost over, but I don't want this to end. I don't want us to end. I've fallen in love with you, Sarah, really. And I want us to continue, but now, as a real couple. No bets, no games." "Sarah," he said during dinner, his voice full of a nervousness he hadn't anticipated feeling. They had begun as enemies, but now they were in a deep and genuine love, and Sarah looked at him, surprised by the sincerity of his words, but also warmed by the realization that she felt something for him too, something that had subtly developed over the past few weeks. "And I want to try," Sarah said in a soft, yet firm voice. "I love you too, Tom. I want to start a relationship with you, but this time we will be equals and a true couple." Both of them were ecstatic during those moments, having conquered seemingly insurmountable challenges and now being prepared to proceed together. It wasn't until after a checkup that Sarah realized she was pregnant, but months later she began to notice something different about her body. She felt queasy in the mornings, something she wasn't used to. Tom was ecstatic when Sarah told him, and he embraced her while simultaneously laughing and crying. All of their past suffering and heartache seemed to have led to this moment of rebirth, and they were prepared to begin a new life together with a new family on the way. "I want to marry you again, but this time for real, not because of a bet, not for any other reason than that I love you and want to spend my life with you. I want to do this right this time," Tom said, fully aware of what he needed to do. Sarah said, "I want that too, Tom," with a smile and happy tears that mixed with his. "This time it'll be a real wedding, a fresh start." Tom knew he still had a lot to prove, not only to Sarah but also to himself and the families he had wronged in the past. But now he had something to fight for, a new life alongside the woman he loved and the child they were expecting. And this time he was determined to be the man Sarah deserved and the father their child would need. Their new wedding was a small celebration with a few close friends and family. There was no fleeting glamour, no rush from business or bets, just Sarah and Tom, bound by true love, prepared to face the future together. Sarah put her head on Tom's chest and muttered, "Who would have guessed that it all began with a bet?" as they danced slowly at the conclusion of the ceremony. "Who would have guessed that it would be the best bet I ever made?" Tom said with a smile while embracing her. And they were prepared for the next phase of their lives, one that was full of love, redemption, and hope. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your thoughts about Sarah's decision to forgive and marry Tom.